Hello everybody, how's it going? Today we are talking about small n designs, sometimes called single subject designs. Now, a quick confession from me, one of the cool things, I guess, of, like looking back at kind of my experience with research, is that I've dabbled in a lot of different things, like non-human research, human research, online research and surveys, and neuroimaging. Done a lot of different things. One thing I haven't done is single subject designs. I haven't had a chance to actually do that and have a hands-on experience with that first person. But it's kind of an interesting area of psychology and of research, so let's get into it. So I have a couple of videos for you here, and really there's a couple of reasons why I have some of these videos. Let's start with the first one. So this first one right here, you can think of this as a intense case study. Now, we talked about case studies very briefly earlier in the semester. Case study is whenever you spend a lot of time looking at one individual. So the individual in this video, I'm not going to give away too much of it, but in these videos, you can look at a young girl who has part of her brain removed, and you can track her progress across time. Now, following this individual's progress across time is going to teach or help us understand more about how the human brain works by watching it change over this person's lifespan. So this is an example of how looking at one individual can tell us a lot about human behavior. These other videos, Phineas Gage, Henry Mlazen, and Clive Waring, they're all referring to people that we're going to be talking about in this lecture. So if you're not familiar with some of these people, as we're talking about them and you're interested in it, you can check out these videos for more info. And I definitely recommend, for example, this Clive Waring video. It's like 48 minutes long, so don't feel like you need to watch the whole thing, obviously. But the first few minutes are really interesting because Clive Waring is the man, ... with no memory. And if you want to see what it's like to live life without access to memory, that is a kind of a really compelling video. Okay, so let's get into it. A lot of times when we talk about research, there's a rule of thumb that the more people you have, the better off you are. And you know this because I've read some of your discussions and I've seen it. I've seen you kind of talk a little bit about, like, oh, we need more of this kind of participant, or we just need more participants in general. So, why is that? Usually it's because we are trying to increase the sample size so that way we're reducing the impact of individual differences among participants so that we can look at broad changes in behavior across conditions or across groups. But we might not always want that. We might, in some cases, want just a single person to study. And so there's a couple of reasons why we might want to do that. One is because if we're using a small n design or a single subject design, it usually means that we're interested in a rare population. So to go back to the previous slide, an individual that has part of her brain removed, right? That's a very kind of special population because it does not happen to everybody. So it might be helpful to track this individual to see how and if their behavior changes. This can also apply to the second point here. Maybe somebody that has a rare neurological disorder. That would mean that they are a rare population or a special population. Maybe we are looking at an individual who has some kind of extraordinary circumstance or some kind of extraordinary experience. So here I say, like maybe a celebrity, but another example would be like if we're studying an athlete, right? Like a special athlete. Like if we wanted to know, LeBron James' psychology. Maybe we follow him around and we check out what he eats for breakfast and things like that. That would be an example of using a small n design to understand peak athleticism or whatever. And this kind of melts in with this, this other criteria, which is maybe it's somebody that has an incredible ability. So maybe if it's somebody who has an eidetic memory or a memory that's incredibly good, that's the research article that we're going to be looking at associated with this chapter is all about an individual that has an extraordinary autobiographical memory. Or maybe we are doing something a little less, rare, where we're just going to look at how a treatment plan or a teaching technique or an intervention style works on a group of children that you are working with in your day job. So whatever the circumstance is, we can look at a couple of examples of how they might come into play. All right, so for large N designs, when we're mostly talking about, like, an experiment where you're comparing groups of people, usually what happens is that you're going to take those participants, you're going to group them up, you're going to randomly assign them, so you're going to have just groups of people. You're going to maybe have a control group. You're going to, whenever you're presenting your data, you're usually going to do that in what we call the central tendency, which is usually the average or the mean. Sometimes we might look at the median too, but when we talk about data, we talk about trends, we talk about patterns, we talk about averages. And the goal of this research is to generalize to others. We want to understand this sample so that we might be able to draw some kind of conclusion about the broader population, right? That's the whole reason why we do this, is that we can extrapolate to the rest of the population. But small N designs have different ambitions. These participants are usually going to be treated on an individual basis, separately. It's almost always going to be repeated measures, so you're usually not going to have discrete groups. So you're not going to have a treatment group and a control group. Usually you're going to have the control group is then going to get a condition where they do the treatment, and then usually they go back to control or something like that. So it's going to be within subjects and repeated measures. Instead of looking at data averages in trends, usually you're going to have data that represents one individual, and you can track that person's behavior and see how it changes. And then usually the goal here is not necessarily to generalize across the population, but for some kind of change to happen for this very specific group, or this specific individual. So totally different focuses. It's kind of interesting for that reason, that we might use a small N design to understand behavior, but kind of tackle it from a totally different angle than what we've been doing this semester. So to give you kind of an example of this, applied behavior analysis is a field some of you probably know really well. Some of you may even already know that whenever you graduate, you want to get either a degree in applied behavior analysis, or you want to get a job in applied behavior analysis. But B.F. Skinner, who, if you don't know B.F. Skinner, he is considered probably the most influential psychologist of all time. Maybe second to Sigmund Freud, but it really depends on who you're asking. He has this quote that I love, and he supposedly said it. I don't think it was actually in a book, so it could be apocryphal. But the quote is, "It is more useful to study one animal for 1,000 hours than to study 1,000 animals for 1 hour." Now, whenever I was in your shoes taking research methods and I heard this quote, it kind of blew my mind because I hadn't thought about it that way. Because I think there's a lot of truth to that. If you want to understand somebody, right? If you want to understand somebody's psychology, it's much better, to follow that individual for 1,000 hours and really understand them than to study 1,000 people for 1 hour to try to extrapolate for that individual. So he did this generally with rats or with pigeons. He did a lot of non-human research, but applied behavior analysis, which kind of comes from a lot of his impact, his influence on psychology, ABA carries on this tradition. And so ABA does not really do a lot of big experiments. Usually they do a lot of small N studies, looking at how treatment plans can impact individuals. And then, if you are a practitioner or a counselor in this field, you might see those research articles and you apply them yourself. So ABA looks at how things like reward and punishment and other kinds of operational conditioning elements of psychology, how those things can affect behavior. Oftentimes you're going to be working with folks that have developmental disabilities, or you might be working within the education system for people that are having some issues learning. Maybe you're working in health psychology because you have somebody who's got some health issues that you're trying to work with them on. Whatever the case may be, you're using applied behavior analysis, and you're going to be using a single subject or a small N research design if you are. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples. Let's say that you're not doing applied behavior analysis. When might you come across small n or single subject designs, let's go through a couple of different case studies. So one of them is going to be HM. You can find him in the video series I posted in the slides as Henry Molaison, and you can find that guy right here. HM is considered the original man without a memory, and I think he's widely recognized as the most studied individual in the history of psychology. So if you were to look at what individual in the world has spent the most time being studied, is going to be Henry Molaison. Now, the reason for that is kind of tragic, actually. Whenever he was a young man in his 20s, I believe, he had very severe epilepsy. And his epilepsy was so bad that it was essentially going to imperil his life if he didn't have something done about it. So, there was a very enthusiastic neurosurgeon who believed that he could help out Henry Molaison, and the way that he could do that is by administering a lobotomy. Now, there's lots of different kinds of lobotomies that exist in the history of psychology. The one that this particular neurosurgeon had planned was to remove a center part of his brain, in fact, the medial temporal lobe. And the medial temporal lobe has a lot of areas of the brain that are associated with memory. The neurosurgeon did not know this at the time. This is part of how we know what the medial temporal lobe does, because after they took out the medial temporal lobe for Henry Molaison, he was totally unable to create new memories. So, in other words, after he woke up from his surgery, he essentially never created a memory that he was aware of again, and he lived for decades after this. And so this condition is called anterograde amnesia. And if you've ever seen, for those of you movie lovers out there, there's a really great movie called Memento that is about this condition, about anterograde amnesia. And it was directed by the guy who did The Dark Knight and Interstellar and Inception, those big movies, Christopher Nolan. It was one of his first big movies. Really interesting, though. But in this condition, what happens is that you essentially forget things as soon as you learn about them. So within about 30 seconds, he wouldn't remember whatever you told him. And so researchers spent a ton of time working with him to understand how memory works. And so when we talk about things like short-term memory versus long-term memory, that is because of this guy. This is because this guy's life and how this surgery impacted him helped us understand how memory works in the human brain. It comes at a great cost, though, right? So he lived, like I said, for decades, and people were able to do things like, I'm going to circle back over to this task right here, just to kind of explain a little bit about Henry Molaison and why he's so important. This is called a mirror tracing task, and so you can see that there's an individual who's they're trying to trace inside the lines of this star, and the only thing they can see is this mirror right here. And so they don't have a lot really good coordination, right? Because they're kind of struggling to do this in reverse because they see it through the mirror. The interesting thing about Henry Molaison is that he could not create new memories, but he couldn't create new memories that he was aware of. Because for this task right here, where you're drawing inside the line, this is something that you get better at over time. And so they had Henry Molaison do this task several times. You wouldn't even need to do this hundreds of times, just a couple of times. And after a couple of times, you're going to get really fast at this, and you're going to get better at this. And so the interesting thing about Henry Molaison is that his behavior would show that he had done this before because he'd gotten really fast at it and really good at it. But if you ever asked him, do you remember doing this task before? He would never say yes. For him, it was always the very first time he was trying that task before, which tells us something about human memory. There's different components, some of it that we're aware of, some of it that we are not aware of. And for Henry Molaison, removing that medial temporal lobe seemed to only impact the awareness of the memories that he was forming. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you got to take my cognitive psychology class because we talk about memory a lot in that class, and you'll learn about them and the nature of memory more there. So this is an example of how understanding or really spending time with one individual can tell us a lot about human behavior. Another example is Ted Bundy. Good chance you've heard of Ted Bundy more than you've heard of HM before. And I should mention, the reason why I keep calling him HM is because for the longest time he was just known in the scientific literature as HM because he was anonymous. His identity was protected because he was alive while these things were published, and he was living his normal life. Alright, so Ted Bundy, he's a public figure, right? Because he was a serial killer in America, and after he was arrested, and I think if you go to Netflix, I can't remember the name of the documentary. It's probably called the Ted Bundy Tapes or something like that. Basically, they recorded a lot of interviews with this serial killer, this really heinous serial killer. Like, whatever you're thinking, like, what is the worst thing he could do? He probably did something pretty close to it, like the most despicable things you could imagine. And so after he was arrested, psychologists interviewed him, but also a lot of people in his lives to try to understand what would drive an individual to do something like this. And you may ask, well, why are they spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to work with this guy and to spend resources interviewing this guy and people that he knows? Isn't that a waste of money? He's despicable. But here's the reason that that's important, is that if we can understand why this guy decided to do the really horrible things that he did, then maybe we can understand not just why he did it, but also how we might be able to prevent it, and how we might be able to understand and maybe help somebody who's in danger of becoming like this whenever they get older. So that kind of data is very invaluable, because serial killing is not a common thing. How many serial killers do you know in real life? I don't know any. And that's because it is, even though we see it a lot in the news, maybe, we know the names Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer and things like that, but we know them because those are kind of rare, that they just don't happen all that much. And so, serial homicide is not a frequent occurrence, and it is not something that you could devise into an experiment. I'm just trying to imagine the ethics of an experiment where you say, all right, we got one group, this is a control group, we want you to go about your normal Sunday, and this group, we want you to be a serial killer. So for this Sunday, we want you to go out and kill somebody. Right? You can't do that. So so you have to rely on single end designs, or small subject, or small sample designs to understand that kind of behavior. Now let's shift over to a slightly less depressing example. This is Jean Piaget. He was a Swiss psychologist. I mentioned B.F. Skinner as being the most influential psychologist of all time, perhaps. He is probably number 2 or number 3 in that list. Jean Piaget is developmental psychologist. If you take childhood psychology, or child development, a class in the psych department, that class you're definitely going to learn about Jean Piaget. And his work is really, really interesting. In my history of psychology class, we read some of his stuff, and a lot of the students are really kind of surprised because it's not research like we normally think about it. His research was essentially that he would follow children around and keep very careful notes about what they were doing and what kind of things they were interacting with, what kind of things they were interested in, and what kinds of things they noticed. Very famously, he studied where he coined the phrase object permanence, if you've ever heard of that, which is how, like, for example, if I show you this cube, this Rubik's Cube, and then I take it off camera, you still know that this cube exists even though it's not on camera, because you have object permanence. You know that just because you don't see something doesn't mean that it's not there. So you know whenever it comes back in front of the camera, it's not surprising, right? But if you're an infant, if you're 6 months old, that rocks your world. It's amazing that this goes away and then it comes back. It's peekaboo, right? So those notions of psychology came from Jean Piaget. And the way that he would do research is just by making notes on single subjects, by following around totally average, typical kids, and then kind of, like recording their behaviors and then comparing notes. And what he would do is, after he would compare these notes across all these kids that he kind of followed, he would make hypotheses. And he would say, you know what, I think that object permanence must be learned around 9 months of age or something like that. And so he'd make these hypotheses, and then other researchers would come in and they would try to test those hypotheses. So this is an example of how single subject design can be used, or small n designs can be used as kind of like a pilot study, where you're monitoring a group of individuals so that you can then create a hypothesis that would require larger experiments to take care of. So that is Piaget. Doesn't he look so nice? He looks so happy with his little beret and that. Man, that looks like a cozy jacket. All right, and so this image, the reason why I chose this is because this is a kid who's going to learn about conservation of matter, which is like if you were to, it could be the case that these glasses contain the exact same amount of fluids. It's just that they look a little bit different because of the shape of their glasses. Something that you know very well, but kids don't know all that well. So this kid's like, oh, I want this glass because there's more of it in there, when in fact it's just that it looks like there's more. All right, so a little bit more about single subject designs. This comes from the textbook, and I thought it was really interesting, and I wanted to go over it. So here are some of the assumptions for this kind of research. Number one is that the first assumption is that it's important to focus on the behavior of individual participants, because whenever you're doing group research, what happens, and this is kind of by design, is that you're going to get a large group of people so that the individual differences among them is not as important. That what's important is what they have in common and not what separates them. And what single subject designs say is like, no, actually it can be very valuable to get to know people's individual differences instead of hoping they go away whenever you average them into a group of individuals. The second assumption, the second thing that people who use single end designs use and one of their principles is that it's important to discover how relationships change because of an independent variable. And this is kind of obvious because most experiments are like this. But what they're saying is that if we want to understand how behavior or a causal relationship of behavior about whether or not something causes a behavior to happen or to change, then we can look at one individual and we can track that kind of in real time. We don't have to look at, again, group trends. And that is essentially a normal experiment, just with a single subject or a very small sample size. And then finally, the next assumption is that it's important to study consistent effects that are biological and social in nature. So this is a way, and the book refers to this as social validity, which is not a term that you see very much outside of this chapter, actually. But it's kind of like external validity. And so what they're saying here is that there are some effects that, again, are incredibly important that might get overlooked whenever we try the traditional kind of big group study styles. So here is a couple of examples. Here we're looking at dog phobia, and this is an example of applied behavior analysis, where we're going to be looking at 3 subjects, and we're going to be looking at how their behavior changes. And so in this case, we have 3 children that have autism spectrum disorder, and we are looking at their fear of dogs. We don't want these kids to be afraid of dogs, but they are afraid of dogs. So the researchers in this article basically designed a treatment plan to look at whether or not they could get rid of that phobia of dogs in these individuals who are codenamed John, Sally, and Bob. So what we're looking at here on the y-axis and the x-axis, on the y-axis we have the total distance from the dog, so how far away the dog is, or how close they were willing to approach the dog. So the higher the value here, the further away that kid needed to be away from the dog. So the higher it is, the more scared they are. The lower it is, the more comfortable they are around the dog. And then on the x-axis, we have how many different sessions we have. So essentially, it's kind of like over time. So here's how to interpret this graph. We look here at baseline, so this is their normal behavior, and we see that John likes to kind of be away from the dog. He does not want to be around it. And so then after we introduce this new treatment style, which is contact desensitization plus reinforcement, which basically means they're going to have these kids exposed to the dogs, and then they're going to give them like treats or reward them for whenever they get closer to the dogs. And what you're looking at here is pretty much as soon as they do that, within one session, John became best friends with the dog, right? And then after that, he was totally all up in that dog's business and was really happy to be around him. And then they introduced this new kind of condition, which is it generalizes over now to 2 dogs. You might not be able to see this stuff because of my portrait right here in the video, so feel free to check the lecture slides for this. Alright, so that is John's data. Now we can look at Sally's data. So we're going to do the same thing. Let's look at Sally's data. We see that her baseline, or her control behavior, if you want to think about it that way, that she's generally kind of hovering around, 10, 15 feet away from a dog. She doesn't want to get too close, except for these 2 days where she was really close. Then after this treatment started, the contact desensitization plus reinforcement, we see that she is all up on those dogs again. Basically 0 feet away from the dog for every single session, and then whenever they generalize to 2 different dogs, she's right there with those dogs, those new dogs, showing that it didn't just stay with this one dog they were training with. And then finally we see Bob. His behavior is very volatile. So here they didn't introduce the treatment until about, looks like, session 12 or 13. But you can see that as soon as they do, that he gets closer to the dog, and then whenever they introduce 2 new dogs, that he is pretty close to them. So this is an example of applied behavior analysis and how we can tweak these different things and look at how it affects behavior. So hey, this is kind of cool because you can look at the data immediately and draw conclusions about it, right? You can see immediately when those changes take place because we're looking at these small n designs. Our ability to look at this and draw those conclusions is what people call visual inspection. Visual inspection is essentially, and this is funny to me because it's a bolded term in the textbook, but visual inspection is a really fancy way of saying that researchers, they eyeball it. They look at it and they're like, yeah, you can see that it changed behavior, so let's publish this. They don't use fancy statistics to try to understand those group differences because they don't have groups. They're just looking at individuals. Alright, so this is, we would call this actually an ABC design. And the reason for that is because we have 3 separate conditions that are all different from one another. So it's an ABC design. We'll talk. And the reason I wanted to get you thinking about that language and those terms and thinking about it as like an A, a B, or maybe an ABA, as we'll see here. So we can also have reversal designs, and reversal designs are nice because they allow you to use the same participants as their controls. So you might have, let's say, you want to try out this new therapy technique. Actually, let's think back to this example here, that we have baseline, so we have their regular behavior towards dogs. Then we're going to introduce a treatment style, and that's going to be B. And then if we decided to go back, where we're not going to reward them for being near the dogs, we're just going to bring them back to that original dog at the very beginning, then this would be an ABA design. Baseline, treatment, baseline. So we have condition A, condition B, and then we're going back to condition A. That is also called a reversal design because we implement a change and then we reverse it. And when you do that, one of the cool things about it is that it means that your participant is also their own control because you're going to compare their normal behavior with this treatment style behavior or with this intervention behavior or whatever the independent variable is that you're looking at. So by doing this, we might be able to look at whether or not this new therapy style is changing behavior. If the behavior changes because we introduce this new therapy style, can we be sure that it's the therapy that's causing that behavior? Not necessarily. And you know this already because you learned about things like maturation effects or other kinds of confounds that might affect this, like a history confound. A reversal design helps us understand the causality here because we're going to go back to condition A. So if it was something like a confound or maturation effects, then we would see that it shouldn't go back to baseline. Does that make sense? So, yeah. So basically, this reversal design, we can see like if the treatment style actually works, because if we go back to baseline, we might see their behavior go back and revert back to what it was. So here is an example where what we're looking at is looking at a paper that was examining OCD. And so we have the number of sessions over here, and then we have the number of rumination responses per minute. So how many times they ruminated or fixated on a thought over a minute. And so this is looking at one individual. So before the treatment, this individual was in this session thinking about basically 13 times a minute obsessing over something or ruminating over something, 7 times a minute, 7 times a minute, 4 times a minute, 6 times a minute. That's a lot of time, right? So with the treatment introduced, so again, if we want to chart this out, we could say that this is condition A, and then we have a new condition, so we're just going to say this is condition B for now. And so with this treatment, now you can see that, oh wow, this really impacted their ruminations per minute. It really made it drop. It seems like it has an effect. But how can we make sure that it's the effects of this treatment and not just because their symptoms have gone away over time? We can remove that treatment, and that brings us back to baseline, which is condition A. And so you can see, like, you know, it didn't stay down here. It went back up. The ruminations per minute went back up. And so we reinstitute the treatment, and when that happens, it goes back down. But again, we take away the treatment, which again is condition A, and you see it pops back up. Then we implement the treatment again, condition B. Then we go back to A. Then we go back to B. And so what we're doing is we're reversing this, right? This would be an A B A B A B A B design. All right. So one other kind of style that the textbook talks about is called a multiple baseline design, and we actually already looked at this when we were talking about the dog phobia example. But a multiple baseline design is going to stagger the length of time that these individuals are in their baseline. So how many sessions they go, or how many days they go without the treatment or without the intervention. And so this way you're able to see whether or not, like, if all of them changed at session 5, so you know we implemented the treatment after that point for all of them, then we might not be able to draw conclusions about, like, are we sure that it's just not after 5 sessions that they all get better and that's what it is? So by staggering this out and by having multiple baselines, we can say, like, okay, it's not just that after 5 sessions that they get really better in their social skills, because we had this individual go 8 days without it, and we had this individual go 11 days without it. And it wasn't until we introduced that social skills training that their behavior started improving. So that is one of the advantages of a multiple baseline approach, is that it essentially puts these individuals on different timelines, so that way you can rule out the effects of other kinds of confounds that might be affecting the data. Here is an example of why an A-B design is important. So this is an old memory test that was looking at whether or not techniques were working for Alzheimer's. Now this is back in the 80s, and as we know, Alzheimer's is very treatment resistant. It's not an easy diagnosis to deal with, because there's not a lot of things and not a lot of behavioral interventions that can be lasting or that can reverse symptomology. So if I were to see this right here, I'm looking at this data and I see, like, all right, for this individual, what we're looking at is seeing if we can improve their memory and how many words they recall over this short list. And so we have, in 2-week intervals, we have baseline, so we aren't changing anything about how this individual's treated, and we're testing their memory, and we see that they're not very good at it at all, right? This individual is remembering either 0% of the words or maybe 10% of the words. Not so good. And then, for these researchers, they decided to try a different style, where they asked the participants to try remembering the list of words by using an expanded rehearsal technique, this new strategy. If you want to learn about it, you got to take cognitive psychology, like I said earlier. And so here, it looks like this individual is actually getting better, like their memory is getting better. But we have to be careful. Why do we have to be careful? Because this is an A-B design. We aren't 100% sure just on this data about what is controlling behavior here. Is it the case that this expanded rehearsal is in fact helping behavior, or is this the case where just by chance that after the 5th session, they picked up on some new strategy, or they got something new in their food or their diet, and that's affecting things, or maybe this new medication they're trying happened to be on this day too. We might not know. So what we would need to do, if we wanted to draw kind of causal inferences here, is that we would need to implement a reversal design. We would need to implement condition A, and we would need to say essentially, all right, now go back to how you were normally kind of remembering these things. Try to use those strategies. Don't use this new strategy for remembering things. And if it went back down, then we might say, okay, yeah, it looks like this expanded rehearsal technique is effective in controlling behavior and helping people recall memories. All right. So, one of the final things I want to talk about is validity in case studies and in small N design. So I wanted to take a quick look at some of these things before we leave this chapter. So in terms of talking about internal validity, which, in case you don't remember, internal validity is the idea that you are measuring what you think you're measuring. So are you actually measuring the dependent variable you think that you are? Internal validity can be really, really high in these cases because you're directly working with the individuals, and you can tell, for example, I'm going back to this because it's my favorite example. You can see, like, okay, yes, it is the treatment that is affecting this behavior. It's not some kind of group trend. It is this specific treatment style that is affecting things. So we can be very certain about the internal validity of that study because we are working with them directly. In terms of external validity, so whether or not these findings generalize to other people out in the real world, that's kind of a toss-up, because in many cases it can be lower, and sometimes that's kind of by design, right? So if you're talking about studying Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, those lessons may not generalize to everybody, and that's okay because these are individuals that are very rare and very uncommon, and we don't see them. We don't see individuals like that very much in society, and so you may not want it to really generalize and have a whole lot of external validity. But as I mentioned earlier, we also have social validity, which is how participants might interact with others whenever others are present, and so we can look at social validity where we might not really be able to if we're looking at group differences, for example. So external validity is kind of a toss-up. Personally speaking, I think that external validity, it leaves a little bit to be desired for small N designs, but that's a little bit maybe of a personal opinion on behalf of me and not of your textbook. And then finally we have statistical validity, which this is kind of an interesting difference here, is that stats are not really used in single subject designs. Oftentimes people will look at figures like this and draw conclusions from that and not really worry about analyzing the data. Excuse me. Which, as somebody who teaches stats, is blasphemous. It's heretical. People should be using stats. But I think, so for me, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that, to be honest. Like, I really like stats, and I really like looking at probabilities and frequencies and trying to understand behavior by looking at the computational side of things. But I think there is value to be had in looking at the actual real-time change in behavior like what we see here. So for statistical validity, those are quite different between the two fields. All right, so that's it for this chapter. We got done in about 40 minutes, which is great. So I gotta think, what should I show you here at the very end of this video? I'm gonna pause this video, and when I unpause it, I'm gonna see if I can find something fun for you as a treat here at the end of this this video. Okay, don't be mad. I don't have a dog in front of me, obviously, because again, don't tell anybody, it's actually 2 a.m. right here, and I'm recording this very, very late. I'm a little bit of a night owl. Y'all know this. So instead of waking them up, I wanted to show you two pictures of the youngest dog, Hopper. So this is, I don't know if you can see this all that well, this is a picture of him watching me play drums. So I am a drummer, and whenever I go down to the basement to play drums, he likes to sit there and just watch me the entire time. So that is kind of what he looks like whenever he's doing that. The next one is over the weekend, I slept until 9 a.m. No, actually it was 8:30 a.m. And he decided to jump up on the bed and wake me up to let me know that it was time for him to go outside in the morning. And that is his very serious face that he's giving me. So imagine waking up and you see this dog just looking at you with this face of disappointment and shame and judgment. He's looking at me like, bro, it's a Sunday. You can't be sleeping in until 8:30. Which I disagree with him about that, actually. Alright, so I'm sorry I didn't have the big fluffy creature in front of me in the flesh, but I felt kind of rude because all three dogs are sleeping. But thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a very good evening. See you later, or morning if you're like me and you're up studying really late or early in the morning. See you later. Bye.